All right, good morning, everyone. So this week we're going to start talking about program design. I'm going to divide this PowerPoint into two halves. So we're going to cover about the first 22 or 3 slides today and this week, and then next week we will do the second half of this. Okay. So program design, maybe as I mentioned before in class, there is a science and an art to it. Okay, we want to sort of keep in mind all of these scientific principles that we have learned throughout the years and semester. But you can't just do this based upon words on paper. You have to actually interact with the human that you're working with, and that is where the art comes into it. Okay, so sticking with the science part mostly, there are a series of variables, and these should look familiar to you, that we are going to look at and sort of determine scientifically what is the recommended way to structure those variables for a training session. Okay, but before we get to that, we need to sort of talk about the needs analysis again, because we really can't start manipulating or setting these training variables such as intensity, load, etc., until we've done the needs analysis and we're aware of the needs and the health status of our athlete or client. So I thought what we would do is we're going to use this case study. So as we go through the different slides and the principles, we're always going to circle back to this case study and think about, for this specific person that I have described in this case study, how would we set the variables. Okay, and your critical thinking assignment for this week is going to do something similar. I have a different case study on that assignment, and I'll ask you to consider that case study and answer the questions that are posed to you on the critical thinking assignment. So I'm just going to read this to you quickly. So this is you're a strength and conditioning coach at a private facility. So what that means is it's like a business. It's not a high school or a college team. You work at a private business that works with athletes. Okay. So you have Keon. He's an 18-year-old senior in high school, male. I didn't say that. He's preparing for his final year of high school, and he plays basketball. He wants to get a college scholarship, and his parents are interested in him receiving some advanced training. So he's participated in his high school's strength and conditioning program for 3 years, and he has a lot of experience in the weight room. So based upon that, that's an important note. He's a very experienced individual. I mean, he's still a high school kid, but he's learned sort of the basics of strength training and weight room etiquette, etc. So moving on, he's free of any diagnosed injuries, but he does report some knee discomfort from time to time when he plays. And although he's in the off season, he's still physically active. He plays pickup basketball at least 5 days a week for 2 to 3 hours a day. Okay, so that's an important thing to note when we're going to look at his training frequency. He's already very active playing basketball, so we can't dump like another 5 days of strength training on top of him. We're going to have to limit that a little bit based upon his current activity levels. Okay, so we'll keep that in mind. We'll come back to it and we'll move on as we answer our questions. Okay, so as we reviewed last week, once we sort of got Keon's paperwork in front of us, we're going to want to either interview him, or based upon the information provided to us in this paperwork, we would do the needs analysis. Okay, this is what we did last week. So we would kind of consider, for a basketball player, what are the movements that are required? What energy systems does a basketball player use? What movement patterns are important for basketball, etc. He did report some knee discomfort, so we're going to want to consider that when we're doing our assessment and program design. So again, based upon him being a basketball player, we would create a fitness testing battery like we did last week. Okay, choose a series of assessments that are specific to a basketball athlete. So we'll get to that here in a second. So with the evaluation of a sport, the first thing that we're going to want to do is the movement analysis. Okay, so the movement analysis is going to ask us again to consider what movements or limb patterns are important for basketball. Okay, so obviously jumping is important for basketball. sprinting, so shoulder flexion, arm flexion, and hip and knee flexion and extension. That's your basic sprinting. But we also have lateral movement. There's a lot of side shuffling, crossover steps, etc. that are involved in basketball as well. So we want to consider that. So I think that the key big ones that we mentioned were jumping, sprinting, lateral movement. Those are probably the three big movements that are important for basketball. Okay. Moving on to the next analysis, we have the physiological analysis. So for this one, we're going to look at what specific domains of fitness or fitness characteristics are important for the sport of basketball. So I did want to just pause and back up 1 second. So the focus of this week's critical thinking assignment is this needs analysis, right? So the needs analysis is really what we need to do before we not only test the athlete, but design the athlete's training program, okay? So moving on to this slide that we were just on, there are some different components of the needs analysis that we want to consider. The first one is the movement analysis. And again, for that one, you're going to consider all of the movement patterns that are important for the given sport. In our example, we're talking about Keon, a basketball player. For the needs analysis assignment that you have for class this week, you are going to use a volleyball player, okay? So the needs of that sport are different, right? With a volleyball player, you're looking at mostly sort of lunging movements. Jumping movements are going to be important as well. But sprinting is really not involved much in volleyball, where in basketball it is, okay? So you want to think about what an athlete is doing in a given sport, and that's what you're going to note for your movement analysis, okay? So now jumping back down to the physiological analysis. So I have a partial list of fitness categories, but there are more things than this, okay? So we're going to think, which of these are important for the sport of basketball? So power is involved with exploding off the floor and exploding from a standing position into a sprinting position. So for basketball, I would definitely want to assess muscular power, okay? Strength is kind of always important for all sports, so we're going to assess strength really regardless of the sport for all athletes. Now, hypertrophy is not really important for a basketball player, so I can leave that out, okay? Muscular endurance, that's arguable, okay, but we can include that one. Now, agility, not listed here, is definitely important for a basketball player, so I'm going to include agility without a doubt. Flexibility and mobility, those are important for a basketball player, so I would include those. Body composition, the lower the body fat percentage, typically that correlates to better performance in basketball, so I would assess body composition, okay? But in general, for the physiological analysis, what you're thinking about is which different components of fitness are important for that given sport, okay? So going back to your assignment for the week for a volleyball player, power, agility, muscular endurance, similar needs really from basketball and volleyball, okay? Now, to contrast that, let's say that we had a distance runner. For a distance runner, we might add aerobic capacity or VO2 max into that category to test. But for a volleyball player, that's not as important, right? So there are things you can include, things you want to leave out based upon the needs of the given sport. Next, we'll go to the injury analysis, okay? So there's two things to consider here. First of all, does your athlete have any current injuries? But secondly, are there any injuries that are common in that sport, okay? So when you're doing your assignment, you might just look that up through a basic internet search. Are there any injuries that are common for volleyball? And just, you can go with those, okay? For basketball, you probably know from watching or playing basketball that ankle injuries are common. Anytime there's a lot of lateral movement in a sport, ankle injuries are going to be common. So having good ankle mobility will help us prevent ankle injuries. Knee injuries are very common in basketball as well. This might surprise you, but again, having good ankle mobility and good hip mobility actually helps prevent or reduce the risk of having a knee injury, okay? So I would say those are the two most common knee injuries and ankle injuries in basketball. There are other injuries that might be kind of flukes that occur, but those are the two most common. So when we're testing Keon, we're going to want to test his ankle mobility, his hip mobility, and his knee stability, because if he has good mobility and stability in those areas, his risk of getting injured will go down. Okay, and if it's poor, then we know through his training program we need to improve those areas to again reduce his risk of getting injured. Okay, now he did report not an injury, but he has knee discomfort in time, so that's a little bit of a warning to us that he might have some instability in his knees and hip and ankle mobility issues right now that are causing him some soreness, and they could down the road lead to an injury. So that's something we want to make sure that we note in our needs analysis overall. Okay. So the last component, the fourth component, is just to consider what his training status is. You know, in general, we would want to think, is our athlete a novice? Are they an intermediate, excuse me, or are they an advanced athlete? And that would really be described by looking at what is their level of training. So on the next slide, just to kind of quickly go to this, it shows you how to classify people based upon their training age. So a beginner is somebody who is trained for less than 2 months. An intermediate is somebody who is trained between 2 and 6 months. And then an advanced trainee is somebody who has trained for greater than 1 year. Now, what is that telling us? Well, the amount of exercise they can handle in their new training program is going to be largely based upon their experience level. So notice that a novice, an untrained person, they're going to get a very low level, a low dose of exercise in their new program. An intermediate person, they will get a slightly higher stimulus, okay? And then somebody who is already very advanced, they can handle a much higher volume and load with their training because they've already experienced some adaptation, okay? So thinking back to Keon, if we go back to our case study paragraph really quick, sorry for all of this scrolling, we did say that he has been involved in his high school strength and conditioning program for 3 years, okay? So based upon that, that would put him into this category as being an advanced trainee. Okay, so that tells us that with Keon, we could get into some pretty advanced training really right away. Okay, and when we're testing him, we could also do more advanced assessments because he has a lot of experience. So again, just to kind of review, the training status will tell us what type of training program they can do, what is the level of intensity that they can participate in right away, and then, you know, what is their exercise technique experience. If somebody's a novice, they're not going to know how to squat and deadlift. So you're going to have to teach those things. Somebody who is experienced, they will presumably already know how to squat and deadlift, and you're going to want to review those techniques with them, but you could introduce those more complex exercises much earlier in the program than a novice, where you're going to have to teach and do a progression to even get to those exercises, okay? And we'll talk about that next week, how to prescribe exercises based upon using like a progression towards more advanced exercise techniques. So we've already reviewed this slide, but again, this is very valuable for determining what size of a dose an athlete might be able to handle when they first start out. Okay, so once we have all of the information from our needs analysis, we would then develop an assessment, kind of like you all did last week, okay? We've identified some of the needs of a basketball player, okay? And in your assignment this week, you'll identify some of the needs of a volleyball player. So our question down here is, what test can we select for Keon? So I already kind of threw these out there, but we're going to want to assess agility for a basketball player for sure. And you'd want to do that for a volleyball player as well. You're going to want to assess muscular strength, muscular power for a basketball player. We might assess anaerobic capacity for a basketball player because they're running at a high level for potentially, 30 seconds to 1 minute, like a period of time where you're going to be using your anaerobic energy system for a long period of time, right? So anaerobic capacity. For a basketball player, though, I may also assess aerobic capacity as well, because the more aerobically fit they are, the faster they'll recover from those quick, short bouts of exercise. So that could be important. We also said body composition is important for basketball, so we would assess that. Flexibility and mobility, very important for basketball because that's how we can screen for and evaluate for the potential risk of injury. So for really any athlete, you're going to want to do the functional movement screen, which if we didn't talk about it last week, we will talk about it either this week or in the future, okay? Now, for volleyball, that would be the case as well. So you're going to assess flexibility and mobility using the functional movement screen, okay? So here we see essentially what the training goals might be for athletes in different seasons. So that's another consideration as well. Like when the athlete is in season, their training volume is going to be a lot lower because they're going to be playing their sport, right? And if they're training at a high volume, then they're going to be very tired and they're not going to be able to do well in their sport, okay? Now, in our case study for this PowerPoint, we said Keon is in the off season, okay? So he would fit in here, okay? His sport participation is low because it's the off season. So his training participation can be high, okay? Just to contrast that, like we said, in the in-season, sport practice in games is high, so the training is going to be lower because they have to have some balance, okay? Preseason, it's more balanced, so medium and medium. They're practicing, but they're not competing in games, so they can get a little bit more training volume in at that time as well, okay? So again, for the purposes of Keon, he is in his off-season, so sport practice is low, resistance training can be high. I cannot remember off the top of my head what I set our volleyball athletes. I think it's a female, where she is in her season. So, but you can refer to this chart to determine that for the assignment for this week. Okay. So once we've assessed our athlete and we've sort of learned what their needs are, we can then start choosing exercises that are appropriate for that person, okay? So again, we choose exercises based upon this needs analysis. So back when we identified the movements and the muscular requirements that are important for that sport, we would want to make sure that we choose exercises that simulate those movements, right? So for jumping, of course, squatting is a movement that is very similar to jumping. So for both a basketball player and a volleyball player, building our exercise programming around squatting and deadlifting both are going to be important because those movements in the weight room simulate the movements they do on the court in both basketball and volleyball, okay? So that's a good example of that, okay? Now for Keon, he's been in his high school program for 3 years. So he presumably would have very good technique. Now, I would, of course, evaluate that in his first session, and maybe even during the testing, we could evaluate that. But if his techniques looks very good with the back squat, a barbell back squat, then we could jump right into that day one. Now, if he has poor form, then we might regress the back squat and use like a goblet squat or something along those lines to teach him the proper form. Think about last week when we evaluated the deadlift. As you saw the deadlift, there's a lot of form that is important for the deadlift. Now, we could evaluate his technique, and if it's sound, then he can begin deadlifting sort of from day one in his programming. But if it did not look good, we might regress him and teach him the deadlift using some other exercises and progress him to the deadlift once his form improves, okay? A few other considerations to consider when you're selecting exercises, and I should say when we select exercise, we're gonna select exercises next week, so you'll see that firsthand. I'm kind of just more talking about it this week. You do need to consider what equipment you have available to you when you're selecting exercises for your program. For example, if you don't have access to a squat rack, then you really cannot do barbell back squats safely with an athlete. If you do have a squat rack, then you can. Okay, that's a good example. If you don't have access to a leg press, then you can't include the leg press in your programming. But if you do have access to a leg press, then you can, right? So that's a pretty simple thing. But it's something that students and younger coaches don't often think about when they're writing a program is, I need to consider what equipment I have available before I start choosing these exercises, okay? While at the same time, as I've said, we're always going to keep the needs of the athlete in mind when we're selecting exercises. Now, here we get into, kind of talking about different types of exercises. The NSCA tends to refer to core exercises as your big squat, deadlift, bench press, sort of those exercises that form the foundation of your program, or they form the core of your program. Now, most fitness individuals, they refer to core as your abdominal area in your body. So I want you all just to note that sometimes different organizations refer to different things using the same word. This is a case of that. So in this PowerPoint, which is based on the National Strength and Conditioning Association's textbook, core exercises refers to those big exercises that use large muscle mass, involves major joints of the body, multiple joints, and they often have a direct application to the sport, again, such as squatting, deadlifting, bench pressing. Typically, those are your 3 big core exercises, and you're always going to want to build programming around those. After you identify your core exercise, you would then choose a series of assistance exercises to sort of complement the core exercise. Assistance exercises recruit less muscle mass. They may only involve one joint, okay? And they're less important for the sport. So a good example of an assistance exercise might be like a bicep curl, hamstring curls, dumbbell chest flies, right? They typically involve one joint, where core exercises involve multiple joints, right? In a bench press, you're using the shoulders and the elbows both. In a squat, you're using hips, knees, ankles, right? Where in a hamstring curl, you're just using the knees. That's a good way to differentiate those two, okay? Most athletes, foundation of their program are core exercises because, as it says here, those exercises have direct application to the sport. However, you really can't do more than 2 core exercises in a given session because they're very physiologically taxing. You would not want to squat, deadlift, and bench press all on the same day's workout, right? You would divide it up. Monday's your squat day with your assistance exercises built around it. Wednesday's your bench press day, assistance exercises built around it. And then Friday could be your deadlift day with your assistance exercises built around it, right? 2 core exercises max is typically what I would recommend in a given daily workout. Then we just have some other types. Power exercises are exercises that are performed explosively. So jump squats, kettlebell swings, Olympic lifts, push press, things of those nature. Those may have direct application for the sport. In our case, with a basketball player and a volleyball player, those are going to be important because explosiveness is very important for those given sports. Okay, where a distance runner, power is not important, so I may not include many power exercises in a program for an endurance athlete. Now, another thing that I like to do is to think about movement patterns when I'm selecting exercises. We will get into this more next week to a great extent, but as we've said multiple times, consider what movements are involved in the sport and pick exercises that mimic those movement patterns, okay? This sticks with one of the foundational principles of training, which is the principle of specificity. So to get better in a given activity, you need to train for that activity. It's kind of obvious, right? But that's one of the guiding principles that we should always keep in mind, okay? And to elaborate on that a little bit more, this is a good example of looking at different movements that might be important for different sports, okay? And then here we see exercises that are related to those movements. So since we're talking about a basketball player, they do have dribbling as a movement pattern, and then they list some exercises that train the same movement pattern involved in dribbling. Dribbling is going to involve, elbow extension. So if you look at all of these exercises, they all involve elbow extension. Jumping, involved in basketball. All of these exercises in here, listed here, use the same movement pattern. Sorry, that keeps happening. The same movement pattern that is involved in jumping. Sprinting, also involved in basketball. Here we see exercises that are important for training the motions involved in sprinting. Maybe to differentiate from jumping, here we start seeing some single leg movements, step ups, lunges. Right, when we sprint, that's kind of a unilateral activity. When we're squatting, both feet are doing the same thing at the same time. When we're sprinting, the legs are doing things independently. So things like step ups, and lunges are good to complement the movement pattern involved with sprinting. Okay. Now, to dig into that a little bit deeper, and again, we'll touch on this next week. I like to use these basic movement patterns when I'm selecting exercises. Okay. The basic movement patterns of the body can be divided up as you see on this slide here. So for lower body, we're looking at exercises that are either primarily involving the hips, okay, or exercises that primarily involve knee flexion and extension. And we could further divide these into double leg, which is bilateral. That would be a squat or a deadlift would be an example of that. Or a unilateral, which is a single leg, which would be step up, lunge, split squat, etc., where the legs are working more independently and staggered versus them being even, where they're working together doing the same thing. Okay. We'll plug exercises into these categories down the road a little. I need to make a note to myself actually about something to show you all in the next PowerPoint. I created a chart which breaks exercises down into these movement patterns here, and it offers a progression starting from basic to complex, which is very valuable. Okay. Then for upper body, we have horizontal push and pull. Horizontal push is like a bench press. Horizontal pull is like a row. Vertical push would be like an overhead press, and then vertical pull would be like a pull up. Okay. And then for the trunk, we have either rotation of the trunk or anti-rotation, which is stabilization of the trunk. The best example I can give you of when you would do that is when you're sprinting. You don't want to rotate your trunk when you're sprinting, right? You want your arms to be moving, but you want your trunk to be stable because that's going to make you more powerful and faster. So you do want to train stability of the trunk using what's known as anti-rotation exercises. And I'll give you a good example of that next week. Okay, let's see. We do want to have muscle balance. So ultimately, when we're selecting exercises, I would want to have equal pushing and pulling. Okay, equal horizontal pushing and pulling, equal vertical pushing and pulling. That's going to help us to, ensure muscle balance. Okay, because if muscles are out of balance, that can lead to injury down the road. Okay, through our assessment, we can often identify if muscle imbalances exist or not. The functional movement screen is great at allowing us to do that. Okay. Let's move on here. So we've talked about technique a little bit. Again, through the assessment, you can learn that. But really, your first couple of strength training sessions with an athlete can also show you how advanced they are. Maybe you pick an exercise and it's too easy for the athlete, so you immediately progress it, or you pick an exercise that's too difficult for the athlete and you would immediately regress it, make it easier. Again, I created a great chart I'll show you next week that gives you some guidance on how exactly to do that. Okay. We've already mentioned availability of equipment. Let's talk a little bit about training session time available, right? Most sessions, athletes are busy. They have class, they have schoolwork, they have homework, practice. So they're going to need to get in and out of the weight room quick. So I would think 45 to 60 minutes, maybe 75 tops, is a good amount of time to allot for a session. But you have to consider warm-ups and cool-downs in there as well. You're not going to write a program that's going to take 2 hours to complete. That's too long. Trying to keep it in that 45 to 75 minute range. During off season, maybe they're doing 75 minutes. During in season, they're doing more 45 minutes. For Keon, he's in his off season, so he can spend a little bit more time in the gym maybe than he will be able to do when he's in season, for sure. Frequency, again, that's going to be based upon what phase they're in their season, right? Off season. Maybe we get Keon in there 3 to 4 times a week. Okay, he might have to reduce his pickup basketball a little bit to get more training time in. Okay, but then once he gets in season, excuse me, he's gonna maybe just go 2 days a week doing strength training, right? So where they are in their season, that's going to determine the training frequency. Okay, so we're going to consider that as well. So for Keon, he's in his off season. We're going to maybe try to work in, let's say, 3 days a week of strength training with him right now. And what this bullet point is referring to is we're going to write sort of weekly workouts. So like a Monday, Wednesday, Friday template where each of those days is different, right? But as we go from week to week, he's going to repeat the same 3 workouts for a period of time, but we're going to make the workouts harder each week. So he's going to squat every Monday, but he's going to presumably do heavier loads from week to week. That's how you would progress. And that's really what periodization looks like. And we'll talk a little bit more about that next week as well. Okay. The training status, we've already sort of talked about that. Less people with lower training status, they're going to need more recovery. So they're going to do less days a week. We've already said Keon is highly trained. So he will need less rest days because his body has already adapted to sort of this higher level of stress. Here's an example of recommended frequencies. This is going to be probably 7 days a week is probably too high unless there's like no practicing at all. We already saw that Keon's playing pickup basketball pretty much every day, 5 days a week. So 4 at the most is what I'm going to do with him based upon his other activities that he's doing. We've already sort of mentioned this bullet point, but just read that one just to reiterate the point that I made earlier. So here's some different ways that we could mix up how we're going to design his program. We could do an upper lower body split, right? If he's only training 2 days a week, that could be a good option. Okay. If he's training 3 days a week, we could sort of separate the muscle groups a little bit more. Okay, here's one way we could do it. Here's another way it can be done as well. Another thing that's not listed on this chart is to do total body every day. Okay, that's also an option. In fact, the research article that I presented to you all in my other class that I teach, the practicum, we looked at the differences between total body and split routines, which is kind of what this looks like. And there's not a lot of difference. Ideally, we would mix it up. So part of the year, Keon could do split training. Part of the year, he could do total body. And the next year, he would do a similar thing. Okay. When we are writing our programs this coming next week and the week after, I'm going to probably use a total body design for you all versus this type. So just be on the lookout for that. Frequency, again, I've already touched on that, so I'm not going to spend time on this slide. But again, the seasonal demands is often going to delineate how much time you're training. We already said Keon's in the off season, so 4 sessions is probably what I would do with him. Loading. So again, this is going to be based largely upon how experienced he is. He's already very experienced, so we could probably load him up a little heavier than a novice. Okay. Since he's playing pickup basketball 5 days a week, he's not going to really need to do any sort of aerobic training or anaerobic training at all. Like with him, since he's playing basketball a lot, I'm going to just have him lifting weights for the most part, right? His skill practice, he's in the off season, so he's not going to be doing much of that. He is playing basketball, so his skills are going to stay sharp, and he's probably going to get better as well. Okay, and that's a physically demanding thing. So adding more training on top of what he's already doing might fatigue him out. Not a consideration for Keon, but if somebody is like a manual laborer, right? Like they're I don't know, a construction worker, for example. That's a physical stress, so that could promote you to reduce their training volume a little bit based upon the other activities that they're doing in life. Okay, so perfect. That's a good chapter break. So the assignment, of course, we have our lecture study questions as usual. That's just going to refer to this first half of the chapter. Sorry. The assignment is not a critical thinking assignment. This is another 25-point assignment. But what you're going to do here is do a needs analysis based upon a different case study. So what I can do actually is just talk about that really quick. Now we'll pick up this PowerPoint with part 2 next week. Okay, so let me quickly just exit out of this, pull up this assignment, and show you all what it looks like here. So here's the directions. I've given you a case study. So here we have a 19-year-old female freshman, Jasmine. So she is a volleyball player, and it explains to you what her situation is. Okay. And then here are your 5 questions. So the movement analysis, the movements that are important for volleyball, the fitness categories that are important for volleyball, any common injuries that are common for volleyball. Again, I would just look that up on the internet and see what you find. Determine her training status based upon what is revealed in this case study. And then I want you to select 5 specific fitness tests that are appropriate for Jasmine based upon her needs and the needs of the sport of volleyball. You can refer back to last week's lecture to get some fitness tests for that. Okay, so that'll do it for this week. We'll pick it up next week with the second half of chapter 17, and we will actually be able to see how to write a program. I'll come back and talk to you all next week. Take care. Bye.